Premier Doug Ford has won a second majority government, making him the third premier in the last 50 years to do so in Ontario, increasing the Progressive Conservative seat count to a total of 83. Now, while the PCs increased their seat total, the campaign was largely seen as a disaster for both the NDP and the Ontario Liberals. What happened? How did Doug Ford cruise through to another majority government? And what does this mean for the future of the opposition parties? And more importantly, does this election result in Ontario give us any indication of what could happen federally? Joining me to unpack this is Michael Diamond, principal of the Upstream Group. Michael, thank you very much for joining me on Counterpoint.
Happy to be here.
So right off the top, what was Doug Ford's recipe for re-election?
Look, I think there were several key components to why the massive re-election victory occurred for Doug Ford on June 2nd. And I think you have to look at it in several buckets. I mean, first of all, he did provide stable, competent, reassuring leadership throughout the COVID pandemic. And that's something that I think surprised a lot of people and made him friends in areas where before he may have been a little bit weaker. Then you have to look at the effort that his government, led by Minister Monty McNaughton, put at turning enemies into friends without making their friends into enemies. And that was with the effort of bringing on growing support with trade unions or groups that had traditionally been very hostile to progressive conservatives, organizations that used to fund the Working Families Coalition, which destroyed Tim Hudak's chances of becoming premier, endorsed Doug Ford, progressive conservative, so that he had growth. And you saw that pay off in some of the ridings that the progressive conservatives picked up, be it in Timmins or Windsor-Tecumseh in Essex. So you cannot underestimate that enough. And then that you just have to contrast his election narrative to his opponents. Doug Ford was very clear and concise in how he communicated. It was a very simple message. It was a very straightforward message, and it really resonated because it was easy to understand and addressed problems that voters saw for themselves.
And on that note of addressing voters and what their concerns were, do you think that maybe the Liberals and the NDP miscalculated in trying to use the pandemic as an attempt to wedge the premier to run on his record?
Absolutely. And they did. That was a miscalculation for a number of reasons. One, I think Stephen Del Duca, Doug Ford, throughout the pandemic, was able to defer that he was taking advice from the chief medical officer of health, something that I think is actually reassuring. This is a matter of great importance. And there are certainly areas where, the politicians do have to lead. But in terms of the science, deferring to experts is not a bad idea. Stephen Del Duca made it clear he would not always do that when he announced that he would mandate vaccines for children to return to school, something that the chief medical officer of health has advised against at this point. So that was, I think, a first point where it actually made Doug Ford the pro-science candidate in that discussion and showed that he was leading from competency and an evidence and expertise. So that was one. The other was that Doug Ford actually did deliver and was that reassuring leader that I mentioned through COVID. So there was no points to gain there. And the Del Duca and Horvath message on it was just so disjointed, be it Stephen Del Duca's kickoff rally indoors with a couple hundred people that was maskless, and then a few days later announcing that he wanted to reintroduce a mask mandate at grocery stores. It was contradictory and hypocritical and really rang howling for the electorate.
And so, I mean, you've spoken to Premier Ford's record. How much of this would you chalk up to poor campaigning on the side of the two opposition parties?
Well, I think, they're both important factors here. I think Premier Ford and the work that he put in and the re-election campaign he ran definitely deserved to win and be reelected. But from that same token, I mean, I believe, especially at a time like now, where we've all been through a really hard 2.5 years, and it's varied and it's been different in how we've all experienced it, but we've all changed our lives and we've all suffered, and we wanted hope and optimism. And both opposition leaders started. Stephen Del Duca's first campaign announcement announcement was telling folks what he wouldn't do in saying no to Highway 413, which turned out to be so popular that Doug Ford swept Peel region for the first time. The Progressive Conservatives have done that since in my lifetime. I can't even remember when that had happened before.
Yeah.
But Stephen Del Duca started off saying what he wouldn't do, saying no. And that just fed into Doug Ford's hands of wanting to build the province and his plan to get it done and say yes.